Well, welcome listeners to Debra and Peter doing a podcast. Hello, my lovely Peter. Those of you who are listening on audio, in fact, actually, even if you're watching the little video, you won't be able to see that Peter Wanless is just so much my twin, in that he's wearing a shirt that matches his shoes, which is like gorgeous red flowers. I'm not quite sure what the flowers are, but it's an absolutely amazing look. So you look fab, Peter. Fab. I've got outfit envy.
My shoes are quite spectacular. We'll have to find a way of featuring them on the podcast when we circulate it somehow or other. A bit like Sweep and Doc, the dwarf, got a mention last week. Because, we can't really do justice to them, certainly not on an audio, and it's quite difficult on the visual unless I try and put my feet above the level of my head.
Although what you could do is 2 pictures, Peter, one of you in the shirt and one with you with the shoes, and then people can see for themselves.
See if they really match.
So how have you been since last time? What have you been up to?
Yeah, I'm well, thank you. I mean, funnily enough, I'm in the NSPCC headquarters building in London at the moment. This is the first time I've been back since December. I was in town doing bits and pieces, and I thought, I need to be here to record the podcast. I wonder if they'll be kind enough to let me have a room. So they kindly have. They still remember who I am, and there aren't very many people around today, to be honest. And I was trying to keep a low profile, but it's lovely to see, the people who look after the building. I came and I said, I'm Peter, I used to work. Yes, we know. You
said, I'm Peter, I used to work here. That's hilarious.
yeah, we know who you are. Yeah, and then the caretaker type chap, I'm not quite sure what you describe his job description, but he was there immediately to make sure I had everything that I needed and all was well. And so it's nice. It feels like a bit of a homecoming, but I'm not going to do a grand tour or anything. I'll record this and then slip away quietly, I think.
Yeah, because hard though, isn't it? So it's been, what a week, Peter, since last week. I've like veered emotionally between hope, despair, fear, anxiety, hope again, fear again, because of what's going on internationally. And I'm sure you must have seen it, because I can't think there's a person possibly in the entire world who hasn't seen that dreadful exhibition in the Oval Office between Trump and J.D. Vance and President Zelensky,
yes,
which was absolutely mortifying to watch. But it really got me thinking about, how dealing with incredibly difficult human beings, because, Donald Trump is clearly a very difficult, very unpredictable human being to deal with. And I think, it's with a massive ego, undoubtedly. And just watching that and thinking, like, how the hell do you negotiate or navigate your way around those people? And I was thinking that actually, to be perfectly honest, we have some experience of that in the sector. So not quite with those levels of power, but I'm sure you, and I know I have, and definitely listeners will have experienced having to deal with, for example, very rich donors who are, some of them are absolutely wonderful and lovely, but some of whom do sort of have that, I have money, so I know more about life and the world and how you should be running your organization than you do. Or those, ministers or MPs who somehow or other the power of position has gone a bit to their head, and they're sort of in that kind of very superior, be nice to me, be kind to me sort of thing. And I was thinking about, if I'd have been in Zelensky's position, would I have hit back in the way that he did? And I don't know, but all I can say is in my history, I've tended not to. I've tended to think that the only way you can deal with those sorts of egos is to manipulate a way around them, which I know probably sounds awful, because people say, you should absolutely be truthful and tell people they're being dicks. But the reality is, if people don't know they're being a dick, and there's absolutely no way they'd ever hear it or be self-reflective enough to understand it, I'm not sure it helps. I don't know what your thoughts are on the whole thing.
Oh, there's so many illustrations and examples, I suppose, of those situations on a spectrum. I think it's really important, whether you are Zelensky or a citizen of the globe today, or doing your job, to hold true to your values and your principles, which I'm sure you would do. So being manipulative is one way of phrasing it. Another way might be, trying to go the extra mile to find the common ground of what the motivation might be. So when it comes to rich philanthropists, there is some reason for them engaging with you and wanting to support your work. And actually, there are people with very little money and very little to offer the charitable purpose who I found wanted to micromanage with very little knowledge what the charity was seeking to do, rather more than some of the people who are willing to give significant sums of money.
Yes, good point.
It's fair enough. If you're going to give £1 million or a couple of £1 million to a charity, it's reasonable to have a view on what you might want and need to do with the money. So helping create a sort of dialogue which respects your principles and values, but doesn't, their life experiences won't have been the same as yours, or necessarily the vulnerable people you're working with and through. And there's been lots of discussion, haven't there? We had a conversation on a previous podcast about, Band-Aid and whether it's right or wrong to be rescuing vulnerable people in this kind of savior, rather kind of Victorian way that a certain number of older donors will recognize and kind of relate to, but doesn't go down well at all with progressive activists and the younger kind of people. So not getting lost or stuck and falling out with one another, but trying to find the common purpose works. If any of my children's charity CEO colleagues are listening to this, there was a famous occasion not so long ago with a certain children's minister where he really did get my goat and suggested that we weren't being clear about what we wanted. And I said to him, I think we're being extremely clear. I know we're being extremely clear about what we want. It's A, B, C, D, E. And that was the case of he didn't want to hear what we were offering to tell him. And his objective, if I rationalize it after the event, was, I've got very little time in this job. I need to do something quick, and it needs to generate a headline and achieve something within a kind of 6-week period. So don't tell me how to create a context in which some things might work further down the line, despite us having been invited in to offer our thoughts on that. And there was quite a lot of chatter afterwards about, oh, did you see Peter there? He was very angry. and that was a moment where I felt that, what we were being accused of was grossly unfair. So I've got examples of trying to find common ground, and I've got examples of I think that's a good one where I got a bit irritated and rightly got a bit irritated. But there'll probably be other examples where misread the room or not said what it is the other person's wanting to hear.
Did getting irritated work, Peter? Did it just make you feel good in the moment? And then afterwards, did you think, well, that didn't achieve anything? Did you have to go back and...
It didn't achieve anything, but on the timeframes we were working on, it kind of didn't matter. And to be honest, I was fed up with this dialogue, which wasn't going to get anywhere. We could have created an exit point which might have felt a bit more positive, but it would have achieved even less. I think so. Yeah, it wasn't a way of building a deep and meaningful relationship or something was going to last. But we didn't need that with him at that time, I think, is the truth. And so I was probably willing to be a bit more cavalier about it than you're right. Most times I would try and think, where is the common ground? How are we going to build a shared sense of purpose here without compromising?
I suppose there's also the bigger picture here too, because I remember years ago I was sharing a panel with somebody else within the sector, and I won't give too much away because I don't want to, embarrass anybody or what have you. But we had a really massive ding-dong, like a huge disagreement of views. And, I just wasn't convincing him at all. But what I'm reflecting on it afterwards, I realised that I was never, ever going to make this chap change his mind ever. He just was he was absolutely stuck in this particular rigid way of thinking, and nothing I said would change that. But what did change was the minds of some of the people in the audience who were listening. And that's when I suddenly realised that there are times when you're actually not really talking to the person who you're addressing directly. What you're actually doing is talking to a wider audience. And it was, it's incredibly interesting. I've thought that a lot, actually, is when people say, like, there's absolutely no point arguing with people either online or, in conferences or whatever, when they have a different point of view to you. But then I changed my mind about that slightly, because I think there is a point to it if, in the process of that argument, the people listening get their minds changed and think differently.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And definitely with the other children's charities, the fact that I said what I said and the way I said it worked for them and strengthened our sense of collective solidarity. And because I was a bit kind of longer in the tooth than some of the others, the fact that it came from me rather than someone else, I think gave them kind of permission and space and confidence. So I'm rationalizing that a little bit after the after the event, but I think that was a benefit. That was a benefit of behaving in that way at that time.
It's like hindsight is our greatest skill, Peter. But because I thinking back to Zelensky, of course, in the moment, he couldn't. They just turned on him. I mean, there's nothing he could have done really, and I actually think he behaved remarkably well. He didn't really argue with them in the way that they're now demanding an apology. But I think what did happen was, even though it may have caused damage to that relationship in that moment, it shored up support for the whole of the rest of the world.
Yes.
So the public impact of that was that now the world is suddenly looking at America in a very, very different light than before. And also it's galvanized our European leaders to get together and think, right, we can't, we've got to do something because we're on our own.
And likewise, there's been some really great speeches and commentary from Canadian politicians around what they not just him, others around the candidates to succeed him. And there was an interview last night with their foreign affairs minister, and I think they are again both kind of benefiting from and generating that collective sense of confidence that there is another way of thinking about these things, and we don't have to compromise to find the common ground necessarily with the loudest voice in the room, even if ultimately they've got sufficient kind of power and authority that I think ignoring them is a mistake too. So some of the people are saying we should withdraw the offer of the royal visit and this kind of thing. That really is
can't happen.
Counterproductive, because you need to have these people at the table. But the fact that King Charles III is the head of state for Canada,
and
that he has,
because my partner Andy said to me yesterday, he said what he should do is say you absolutely can have a state visit in one of the other countries of which I'm the ruler. How about Canada? It's like, but you sort of feel like they don't seem to realise that. You just wonder about, it's the terrifying ignorance, isn't it, of and world history. It's like when J.D. Vance was banging on about conscription and saying, you're dragging people and conscripting them. You're like, do you not remember Vietnam? You conscripted up and down the country, and that the governments was hated for it. Never mind Korea or the Second World War or stuff like that. I mean, countries conscript. Yeah, it was very, and you sort of think it's just the ignorance and hypocrisy in it, really. But I suppose the broader point for us, there's nothing much we can do as charity leaders about any of this other than keep on doing our work to the best of our ability. But I think we can acknowledge to our listeners, we know how difficult it can be to navigate some of the personalities we have to navigate. And I certainly think about my colleagues in smaller charities navigating their way around, to be honest, Peter, sometimes super pompous council officers, or not even the officers, actually, the elected councillors who, this is going to sound shocking and I'm sure we'll get hate mail for it, but, so many of them I've come across have been sort of middle management business level when they were in the workplace and retire. and then suddenly, lauded about as a counsellor in a local authority, and they can be really, really challenging to deal with, and you are definitely dealing with some egos there. Having said that, there are many who are absolutely awesome and fantastic and wonderful and engaged and cooperative and all the rest of it. I think it's naive of us to say that we don't come across those human beings who we find more challenging to deal with. So I think to listeners, if you feel you've failed, don't worry, but come talk to me and Peter, and we'll give you a hindsight that'll make you feel better about it.
And there are difficult people, and we all see people in different ways, don't we? So there are a number of times that I have been told by female colleagues that they really can't get on with a particular male individual who has been treating them in a differential way, which they find either uncomfortable or insulting. And I haven't seen or experienced that. And understanding and appreciating those different perspectives, and almost always there's something in it. But sometimes if that's happened to you enough, you can then get paranoid about it, I think, and see everything through a kind of prism of victim, which can be counterproductive as well. But it's always good, I think, to talk through difficult conversations, isn't it? There was a time when I did a bit of training when I was at the Department of Education, where they brought in actors to help us role play difficult conversations. And at the time, I was responsible for a relationship with an arm's length body that was responsible for delivering some particular services under contract to the department. And the person who ran this thing was incredibly tricksy and really difficult in a on surface pleasant way, but very undermining. And I needed to have a big kind of contractual conversation about them, but also get into some of these relationship issues. And the idea was you briefed the actor and then they played the part of the individual, and you could stop the conversation and do it again and do it again and do it again. Oh my goodness, this actor, she was the most brilliant. I mean, of course, it was all down to the way in which I had briefed in immense detail all the things which frustrated and irritated me about this individual that I was going to have to negotiate with. But she played the part incredibly well, and it's one of the best bits of learning I ever did, because I tied myself up in knots trying to work out how I was going to engage with this person, and she was an exaggerated act of the individual, but it was really helpful.
It makes me think, though, Peter, it's you talking about, you hadn't witnessed or experienced the behaviour of that male colleague to the female colleagues. And it just makes me think of a situation between me and one of my uncles. So I was it was quite a while ago now, many, many years ago, and I was talking about how when I go, when I travel and I have to stay away in hotels, I never ever eat in the restaurant or go down to the bar for a drink. I always have room service. And if they don't have room service in the hotel, I'll nip out and find a local shop and get a pasty and a packet of crisps and eat them in my room. And he was saying, well, that's terrible. Why won't you eat downstairs? And I was saying, well, because you never get left alone in the restaurant. That's why. It's not always necessarily overt sexual aggressive harassment, but it's very often some bloke will come up and say, oh, do you fancy a chat, or you look on your own? So even if they're just being friendly because they're bored, but you always get hit on like that as a woman. And my uncle was saying, well, I think that must be just you, Deborah, because I've never seen that happening. I think you're exaggerating. That doesn't happen. And I said, well, okay, fair enough, you haven't seen it. I'm just telling you that it is my experience and the experience of most of my female colleagues who have to travel and stay in hotels by themselves. Anyway, I forgot all about that conversation. It was about 6 months later at another family gathering, and he came back to me. He said, Debs, he said, I just want to say that ever since we had that conversation, I've been paying attention. He said, and you're right. He said, you're absolutely right. I've noticed that happening in restaurants, in bars, in hotels. When I'm traveling, I can see that's what's happening to women. And what was really interesting, firstly, the grace of the man to actually come back and say, do you know what, I was wrong, you were right, I have now seen this. But it just reminded me of this point about the fact that it's so easy to think that it isn't happening when we don't see it or experience ourselves. It's so easy, isn't it? I mean, I was at
Yes.
Keto Fest yesterday. It was a fantastic conference, and a lot of the day was about this. If you haven't experienced it, you don't really understand it, and then it's easier to dismiss it. And it's easier to think that people are being hypersensitive. But then there's a reality. You know, we heard from the amazing... she's the chief executive of Sister Space, and my menopausal memory is just rubbish. You know her name, and Dozy Falani, I think it is, isn't it? Anyway, the one who tweeted about the fact that she'd been asked 7 times where she came from when she went to reception.
Oh yes,
at Palace.
yes, yeah.
And she was relaying the story of what happened to her afterwards, like the death threats and the, you know, people approaching her on the streets, and you know they had to get the police involved. And they had to get burglar alarms and you know systems in a house. And you sort of think something we read about and just dismissed. And then I heard her story, and then how sensitive she still is. And I was thinking to myself, of course you're still sensitive about that, and you have every right to be, because even if there's something that you know is probably entirely innocent, nonetheless you feel threatened because this has happened to you, and it's caused you to be wary. And it makes me think a lot about, you know, when women are so afraid of men in general. You know, of course, not all men, but we don't know which men we pass on are threats. We don't know which men in the pubs are threats. You know, men don't come with rapist or, you know, sexual aggressor tattooed on their faces, you know, and often you marry them and you find out subsequently that's who they are. So I think it's really okay for people to be sensitive when they've been traumatized in that way. But it's very hard to understand it when you haven't, you know, experienced that yourself. It was very eye-opening for me, because I've also tended to say, okay, you know, time to move on. But actually, how could she possibly move on? Because she's still being harassed and still being threatened and still, you know. So, yeah, it was really, really powerful. Anyway, good conversation. Do you want to let me tell you what else has been activated?
Yes,
Peter?
Go for it.
So I've been thinking about making tough choices. Now, of course, you know, and this is particularly highlighted by what's happened in the last week or so, but so that the government has decided it really needs to ramp up and bolster its defence spending. And it's decided, as you know, that the way to do that is to basically axe foreign aid. I mean, it's not all foreign aid that's going, but it's a massive walloping great lump of it. And the sector obviously has been up in arms about that. And their arguments about why it's a really stupid decision are good arguments. They're the right arguments. You know, I don't disagree with them. But then I was thinking to myself, okay, but I personally happen to think that we do need to ramp up defence spending. You know, I am afraid, and I do want to make, because our armed forces are absolutely decimated in many ways at the moment. And I was thinking, so if I believe that, where do I think the money should come from? And I was thinking, well, if it doesn't come from foreign aid, do we take it off the NHS? So do we whack a few billion off NHS spending so that we're not improving waiting times and people aren't getting their operations? Or do we whack it off education so that, you know, we've got a desperate shortage of STEM teachers, haven't we? We really, really need properly qualified science, technology, engineering and maths teachers. And so we don't have them. Or do we whack it off social care? So we have more people tied up in hospital beds and not able to go back into the community. And I was just thinking about how tough those choices are, and that there are almost very few decisions you make in any role, whether you're a government minister or whether you're a leader of a charity or, you know, even a manager in a charity, that don't have consequences and that don't have other people being upset about it. I mean, we've literally just had this at DSC because we've recently had a change in product strategy at DSC, and we've done it for good reasons about trying to shore up our financial position and put us in a safer place. But it's not been a popular decision with everybody, you know, and some of our staff are not, I mean, they're not grumbling or horrible about it because we have a very positive, open staff and we tell them the truth. But that doesn't mean that they're, just because we've told them the truth and why we've done it, that they necessarily agree with the decision. And so it just got me thinking about how, you know, all of the decisions we have to make as leaders, whether we're running a country or whether we're running an organisation or whether we're running a team, none of them are clean, in the sense that all of them will have consequences, and some people won't like the decisions we've made, and we can only make the decision we think is the best decision based on what we know at the time, and hope to God that, you know, our sort of punt at what we hope is the right decision turns out to be that way. What do you think about that?
Go on. Well, firstly, it doesn't half help if you're growing your income, because then it's not a zero-sum game, is it? So you can see why the politicians all place a premium on growth, and why we love our fundraisers and our income generators who enable us to face up to choices that aren't quite as constrained as a completely zero-sum game. But that's a bit of a kind of get out. Secondly, I've always tried to be driven by a strategic framework when it comes to making choices. You can't always do that, but if you can be clear about what it is you're wanting to do, why you're doing it, why you're uniquely placed to do it, and over what sort of time period, then choices can flow from there rather more comfortably than we're facing a financial cliff edge and everyone's got to be cut, or we're being driven by the finance guys and girls saying that we've got no choice but to do this. So that would be where I'd start. Even that though can be uncomfortable. So I have had to make redundant in my time at NSPCC some incredibly talented and capable social workers who deliver amazing direct services to children, but they're things which other people could do. And there are children who are being failed in a different and even more urgent way that only the NSPCC could support. And so to pivot or shift the strategy, there are human consequences for people who've done nothing but their best to deliver what you've asked them to do for a period of time, and then the spotlight changes. So there's this phrase about respect your past but don't be defined by it, that I think is really important, and how one helps an organization to evolve from where it is to where it needs to be is really important. There's no need to be kind of cruel or dismissive, even in the most urgent of circumstances. There's something about explanation and understanding. If we come to government, I mean, the defence budget and the aid budget are very interesting, aren't they? And I say this as someone who spent most of their 20s in the Chief Secretary's office in the Treasury. So I kind of lived the kind of process of politicians having to make these choices and trade-offs. And uniquely, I think those two budgets are talked about in terms of a percentage of national output and not what we're getting from the money. So in a way, whether we spend 2.5% or 3% or 4% or 6% on defence, if most of it goes on an aircraft carrier that the ships can't land on, or some piece of equipment that is 15 years late and doesn't work properly, then that's not as effective as spending less on up-to-date equipment, which people really need. But the whole dialogue seems to be about quantum. And similarly with aid, what the money is spent on is really important too. I do get offended, and we talked about this a bit, I think, last week, about trivializing the impact of the aid budget by finding slightly bizarre small programs and claiming that that's what's going on. And it's not so long ago that, Make Poverty History mobilized the British people in a massive way, I think, behind development aid as a really popular and preventative movement that was a great investment that would save us money down the line, as well as being humanely and morally the right thing to do. And we've kind of lost our way a bit in that debate. When I think back to working in the Treasury, Chief Secretary's office, when I was in my 20s, we were only spending 0.3% of gross national product on aid at that time. And the whole battle with the ODA, as they were called at the time, there was always this 0.7% target, but it felt a million miles away. And the only thing that anyone was interested in was, could we get the aid budget to go up a little bit from 0.28 to 0.29 or 0.3 to 0.31? So these are not unprecedented sums of money that we will be spending on development doesn't feel like enough in the state of the world at the moment, and the cliff edge consequences of slashing it on such a short time frame are going to be really problematic, I think, for all sorts of communities around the world. But I think if you polled the public at the moment about should we spend on defence or should we spend on aid, the aid argument's rather lost its way.
Yeah, it has. It's interesting, isn't it? Because the thing about those two particular budgets, defence and foreign aid, is that they're so incredibly interlinked. Because the reality is that if you spend on foreign aid impactfully, as you say, Peter, but most of it I think is impactful, you don't have to spend quite as much on defence, because you're not going to be in as vulnerable a situation, because you're helping countries and people in countries to live healthier, happier, better lives, to not emigrate, to not, raise up against, terrible regimes and things like that. I mean, I'm massively oversimplifying, but the point I'm making. But I think there's also something about, it makes me think a bit about, you see, that there's quite a lot of expenditure which is critical, which isn't going to be obviously impactful until things go wrong. So, for example, with foreign aid, it's very difficult to show, it's because it takes such a long time for change to happen in many ways, is that any support that we're giving to any particular group of people in a particular country, it's going to be decades before that materialises, before those people have got to positions of power or able to do things themselves differently. And it's a bit the same with defence. Most of the money you spend on defence is just making sure you're ready. I think of it a bit like my car. So I'm really poor at servicing my car because I tend to prioritise, other bills over servicing my car. So I very rarely bother. But of course, what happens is, because I don't service it, when it goes in for its MOT, they find all sorts of incredibly costly, highly expensive things wrong with it. And it ends up costing me more than it would have done if I just maintained it the whole way through. And I think that these sorts of long-term budgets like defence and like foreign aid are a bit like that. And I think actually the country as a whole, we've not been maintaining the car. And so, the cam belt's shrieking and the tyres are a bit thin and the brakes are a little bit dodgy. And of course, what's going to happen? And it's because, I do feel for the government in that what they've basically done is that they've suddenly come crashing up to an MOT date and suddenly realise they've got to spend shed loads of unanticipated money. I mean, in their defence, we couldn't have anticipated Donald Trump behaving the way in which he's behaved, which has escalated this whole thing and therefore caused the government to make, these very, very difficult decisions. Anyway, I'm not saying I agree with it. I mean, personally, I probably would have spread the pain across all of the departments rather than just hit one, but I'm not in government, and so I don't know what the choices were.
Well, they said that they were, like many governments previously, they were going to do a strategic defence review in exactly the way you described, to look at the foreign aid, the foreign affairs budget, the aid budget, the defence budget, look at it all together in a piece, work out what the strategy is, look at that alongside everything else, and then the spending review would give us the answer. But then Donald Trump intervened, and I think he couldn't go empty-handed to that meeting, and as a consequence took this very speedy decision, which kind of wasn't as managerial as we might have expected him to have delivered, but worked in the week. But what the consequences will be further down the line, we shall see.
But I must say, for all the criticisms I've had about the decisions this government has made, and how, I think we spoke very early on in the podcasts when we started them about how the lack of hope that there was. I do think our Prime Minister has played an absolute blinder over the last week or so. I think he's been, people sort of go on about how he's boring and not very charismatic and, attention to detail. And I've never, ever been so grateful in my life to have a Prime Minister who is kind of boring and slow and not reactive and not emotional and doesn't leap off and, say things off the cuff. I've felt very grateful for that. Although I have to laugh, bless him, the way he speaks, it always reminds me of listening to the vicar in the church pulpit. He has that very sort of, kind of like vicary sort of tone to his voice. And every time I hear him speaking Prime Minister's questions or giving a speech, I always expect him to end everything that he says with, "And in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, may you all go in peace." You know what I mean? And I don't mean to be rude about it, because we all have, the way I speak is very irritating to other people as well. I totally get that. But it just does make me smile. I always feel like I should be saying, Thank you, Father. When he's finished speaking.
Well, on that note, I think we should probably go in peace
Yes.
for another week. And lovely to see you. Keep smiling and look out for the shoes.
Yes, I will indeed. Bye, all. See you next week. Bye.